My apologies. Another mess up on my part. I'm predestined to hell. Um, Sorry about that. I swore I was trying to avoid doing that. Okay. So part three. Um, where was I? Pelagianism was condemned 418. It is an outgroup term. In the 17th century, there was the term was coined semi-Pelagian. Now, we'll get to that later when we talk about late medieval theology, more particularly in terms of the theological context that Luther kind of grew up in, so to speak, because the term semi Pelagianism has been applied back to that theological tradition. But no one at the time would say, "Oh, I'm not Pelagian, I'm semi Pelagian." No one would say, "I'm Pelagian." It was an outgroup critique of your opponents whom you were arguing with and say that is a Pelagian position. And it had been condemned. So if you could prove that your opponent advocated a position that can be identified or associated with Pelagius, you were, pretty good shape because you could say, oh, that's a condemned position, ergo, it's wrong. Now, some of this will come back, I hope, to see the importance of. But now we're finally going to move on to the whole point of this in terms of the Augustinian Renaissance within this context of the historiographical traditions, with a little bit, I hope, deeper understanding of Pelagianism in that context, and the term the Augustinian Renaissance that Heiko claimed was then this new campaign against the modern Pelagians that began to be associated with this new Augustine scholarship. And I've tried to break all that apart and to bring some order and return to an historical view. And that takes us back to where we left off last lecture with the conflict between John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, and the Augustinian hermit, Augustinus of Ancona, um, and the papal imperial conflict, because this Augustinian Renaissance, as I argue, was born out of the religio politics, the religious and political politics between the emperor and the pope and the papacy, with this Augustinian hermits, as I argued, supporting the pope and taking the sides of the pope, and the pope therefore supporting the Augustinians from that point on. Now I have up here the True Sons of Augustine. That was a development. The Augustinian Order, the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, was founded in 1256 by Pope Alexander IV. Which I think I mentioned, it was one of the newer mendicant orders and was trying to get privileges and everything else. It was bringing together a number of disparate hermit groups, all following Augustine's rule to form one order. So there's tension, there's debate, there's no sense of real identity. But in this papal imperial conflict that the order gained its identity. And I've even argued elsewhere that we should see the foundation of the order actually in 1327. We'll see that in this second. Why? 1327 is the year right before Louis of Bavaria invades Rome. Um, Augustinus of Ancona had already written his Summa, De Potestate Ecclesiastica, for John the 22nd, responding to Marsilius of Padua and Louis of Bavaria, the Sachsenhausen appeal. And it's in this tense context that then John the 22nd not only had Augustinus writing for him, but turned then to the minister general, the prior general of the Augustinian hermits at the time, William of Cremona. And so we have this pretty nasty doctrine out here, or treatise out here, the Defender of the Peace. Um, I've had my staff go through it and extract the 5 most insidious uh, articles of belief or statements, positions. And William, will you do me a favor and refute these? So because if we can refute these 5 positions, the whole treatise will fall. And so William said, yes, Pope, I will try to do that. Did. Wrote his treatise against the errors of the heretics. Sent it to John. John was so pleased with it, he used it to condemn Marsilius in 1328. He, in his bull condemning Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis, he used William of Cremona's treatise, very much like Boniface VIII had used Giles of Rome's on ecclesiastical power for his Unum Sanctam. Now, I think I may have mentioned, I'm not sure if I did or not, Um, but Augustinus of Ancona sent John his Summa, and John was very pleased and granted Augustinus a gift of 100 gold florins. And he says, I will give you an annual salary of 10 gold florins if you continue to write for me. And Augustinus of Ancona does so. Now, William of Cremona um, was already head of the order. There's not a lot Pope John could do for him, but William used, let's say, leveraged almost his support of John to get a favor. Augustine's body, his tomb, was in Pavia. It's a long story, but to make it very short, after Augustine dies in 430, the Vandals attack North Africa, and then Islam takes over North Africa. Augustine's body was then translated from Hippo, where he had died, to for Sardinia, and then was brought to Pavia in northern Italy. So there he was buried in Pavia, in a church in Pavia, which had originally been the Benedictines, but then it became under the auspices of the Augustinian Canons. The Augustinian Canons were a group. It's a difficult story to explain, but they were not the hermits. They were priests. Canon was a priest attached to a cathedral who started following the Augustinian rule in the reform of the 12th century, 11th and 12th century. So they were following Augustine's monastic rule, but they were not a monastic order like the hermits. But they were known as the Augustinian canons, which are simply the regular canons, and regular in the sense of following a regula. We have the regular clergy and the secular clergy. The regular clergy following a regula, or actually grammatically a regulam, accusative rather than nominative. Were called that because they were clerics or priests who followed a monastic rule. Your typical parish priest was called a secular priest. Saeculum is simply the age that we live in. So it's not secular in the sense of I don't believe in God, I'm secular, I'm not religious. It's definitely I'm within the world. It's that active life that I mentioned and talked about the other day on the other lecture or so. That made them the secular clergy as opposed to the regular clergy, the clergy who did not follow a monastic rule. Now, that was the canons, and the canons were in charge of St. Peter's in Erfurt. Well, it's not St. Peter's, excuse me, but the church where Augustine was buried. And William said, okay, John, I'll tell you what,